What's up, and welcome to Side Projects. I am your host, Joe Tannenbaum, and today we are joined by Chris Morrell. Welcome, Chris.
Hello, hello.
Do you want to give the people a little intro for probably the very few people in this audience that don't know who you are, otherwise known as Bossman Chris? This is
That's right.
the moniker.
That's right. I love the nickname. I wish that. My name is Chris Morrell. I'm the CEO and CTO at InterNACHI. We're a trade organization for home inspectors. So we do a lot of certification and education and all sorts of things in the home inspection industry. But I am a programmer at heart. So even though I have lots of other responsibilities, I spend a lot of time both programming for work and programming for fun. So that's that's who I am.
And I would almost say you're sort of the side project king, and I'm going to encompass sort of like tinkering. You do a lot of tinkering. You do a lot of like, what if? Let's look under this over here. What's over here? And I always appreciate that. I feel like I am somewhat frequently getting texts from you being like, hey, you ever thought about doing X? And do you want to hop on and see what I did with X? You know, whatever that thing is. And you're a very curious person, and I really love that about you. It's really a very endearing quality to me. Is that something that's just perpetually? You're always wondering what if in the programming realm?
Yeah, I think that I am the type of person who likes to understand how things work. So I very much can't just like use a thing and just because it works. So I'm constantly.
Are you always source diving? Are you always looking under the hood?
I don't think I've ever used something without source diving it. Yeah.
Wow. Better person than I.
I don't say that as like I don't think that that's like a moral like thing. It's just like that's just the way I am. Like if I don't feel like I have a basic understanding of how it works, like I'm just not comfortable using it. And I think that something about that, you tend to, you just tend to bump into things that then like lead to other things, and all of a sudden, I'm on this path of like, oh, but what if it was different, or what if there was this other thing that used this same technique, or, and I think that, I think that in a lot of ways that, I have ADHD. I have a form of ADHD that is not really the hyperactive, but more is like, it's like a excess of attention, not inattentiveness, right? So like when I get fixated on something, it's very hard for me to let it go.
Yes.
And so I think that a lot of times my side projects come from just like, I had a thought, and now basically I actually won't be able to get anything done until I like pull the thread enough to get bored with it.
I need to see it through to fruition.
Yeah,
otherwise it will never leave my brain.
not through. I mean, God, if I
well,
could see
to your
through
personal
to
fruition, to satisfaction, to satisfaction.
Well, yeah, it's just like I have to get to the point where, like, in my head, I understand everything. I don't, and like as soon as I can see the finish line, it's like, okay, well, now this is not interesting anymore.
Oh man. Same. Yeah, I feel like when the interesting problem has been solved, my brain checks out really hard. It goes, well, the rest of this is just something I've built 100 times before. I don't really care about the accoutrement around it. I just want to like get to the core of it and then let that be a directory in my computer for the rest of my life. Yeah. And often though, I will come back. I will loop back around and be like, oh, I did this in this thing and I did it this way, and it would be nice to snag that little snippet or that little like class that I made. I do that with, so there's always a purpose, there's always a reason. I've almost never left something and never returned to it for one reason or another.
I definitely find that either you come back to it because there's a lesson learned that you want to apply somewhere else, or just code that you honestly just want to like lift out of it and put somewhere else because it's useful, or you come back to it because you have like some new thoughts and like maybe you push it another 10% and then walk away again. And like, I used to really beat myself up for that, the like sort of never finishing, but constantly kind of revisiting. And I've come to appreciate that as like more of a just like a good thing in life. Like I'm getting lots of things out of that like cycle of work. It's just like I'm not necessarily producing new products at the end of it, but that's okay. Like I've got other places to do that.
Yeah, there's no situation in which doing these little exploratory tinkerings doesn't just make like the tiniest little dent in your brain that even if you're not consciously using it for something else, you apply it elsewhere. Something comes out of those little explorations where you go, I actually don't know anything about this. I'd love to know more about this, or I would love to take this new tech and try something. You know, there's always something that comes out of it. And also, and we talked about this on your podcast, Over Engineered, but there is something to like the art of it. There doesn't have to be an outcome. It can just feel good to like tinker for fun, because I feel like a lot of the code that we write is code that has a purpose and has an output and has a product. And there is something really satisfying about like sort of a no judgment coding session where whatever happens. And not everybody is that like views programming or code in that way. Some people, it's just a job and that's totally fine. But for me, like I need sometimes a more abstract experience to serve the greater good in my case. You know what I mean? Like other scratches need itching in order to make the main pipeline actually improve or work better, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, this is a running theme that I feel like I talk about a lot, but programming as art, I think is really, really near and dear to me. I think like everything, you know, you can be an artist and pursue something as art, or you can be an artist and pursue something as a career, and both of those are fine. And a lot of times there's lots of overlap. Sometimes there's not. So it's certainly not universal, but I think for me, thinking about this stuff as like a fulfilling creative pursuit is really a big part of my experience. And
it feels essential, actually. If that aspect wasn't there, I would have dropped this a long time ago. I can't do this like rotely. I can't just do it sort of. I can't be like a little code monkey just like tapping on the keyboard. It's just, that's not the life I can live.
Yeah, no, I agree. I also do think, like, I think the more experienced programmers, and like folks who can solve problems effectively and quickly, a lot of where that comes from is just like having seen this problem before and having like a solution that you know works for something in this general shape, right? And so I think that the other big advantage of working on side projects is just like, you know, if you work at a place that solves one particular type of problem, right? You get really good at solving that one particular type of problem, but like there's all sorts of different, there's all sorts of other shapes out there, right? Yeah. And like you might bump into those eventually, but like, if you're working on the web, you're probably in your main job not going to be doing like hardware integration like stuff, right?
Yep.
And that's fine, but like there will come a time when like understanding like sort of the fundamentals of IO in a different way is going to benefit you in your jobby job. And like having done a side project where you like got into some weird, you know, like system IO stuff, that you'll have that knowledge then to apply. So I think that there's real tangible like sort of commercial value in doing that work too, you know?
Agreed. It's like that meme where there's the guy in front of the conveyor belt and there's a bunch of circles and then a triangle pops out and he says, well, I guess we're making triangles now. But we're populating that conveyor belt with as many shapes as we can so that we can make whatever we want, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
So all that being said, let's talk about a side project. I know you have a lot to choose from. What would you like to bring to the table today? What is tickling tickling your
Sure.
fancy, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a ton of different things that I've been tinkering with over the years that are in various states of completion. Um, and when we were talking about this offline, the one that kind of jumped out, I think, was this linear poker project, which
Yes.
is interesting because it's like in a totally different ecosystem than what you and I typically work in. It's React and Vercel and Next and GraphQL and like all these like sort of buzzword web dev features that we don't use that much in. I don't use much in my day to day. And so that it was an interesting project in like sort of getting to see how other folks experience web dev and some of the like positives and negatives of that kind of really jumped out to me. So
Okay,
like
so
briefly,
let's
are you
zoom out for a
familiar-
second.
Yeah.
I don't know what this thing does. Just give me like what does it do and where did it come from in terms of like you wanted to make linear poker?
Yeah. Okay, so I think I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about project estimation and like whether it's valuable and how to make it valuable. I realize that like in having conversations like John Drexler and I have talked about this a bunch, and that there's like I think there's a very valid argument for just like saying like project estimation is broken and just don't do it. But I think that there's something there. I think it's useful to be able to say like this thing we can all agree at least is bigger than this other thing. In terms of just like planning and thinking about what to do next and how long it's going to take, I think those things are useful for a team to understand a little bit. And so back when we used Jira, we used a Jira plugin that did planning poker, and planning poker comes in sort of two forms. There's like a version of planning poker that's more traditional, where you basically like bring up an issue onto the screen or into the app, and like everyone on the team independently gives it a score, right? Whatever your scoring system, whether you use like shirt sizes or like Fibonacci curve, or like there's all sorts of different ways to do like scoring, but everyone gives it a score.
Okay.
And then you kind of like everyone reveals their card at the same time, and then like it's an interesting way to like bring a conversation around like either everyone gave it the same number, easy, we just like we all agree this is a 2 and
that's
we move
what it
on.
is. Yep.
Or it's like one person said it's an 8 and one person said it's a 2, and it's like, oh, obviously like this is like this issue is too fuzzy, and like it's not clearly defined enough. We need to like understand what the problem that we're trying to solve is more clearly, so that we can like have a clear understanding of like how hard it is to solve that problem.
Okay.
So that's planning poker, and it's like a really interesting process. The software that we used had an alternate version, which was just like basically it was like a relative scaling method, where you essentially just like, it was almost like a Kanban board, and you would just like take each ticket, and just like all you did was like put it, is this like more like these ones over here or more like these ones over here, and like these ones are bigger than these ones, right? So you kind of like bring everything, you make everything relative to each other, and then you just like give a point score to each column, which I think the like cleverness of planning poker is fun, but I actually found that process to be much more useful, at least for us at that time and like our team. And so when we switched to linear, one of the things that I kind of missed was like, Jira, for all of its faults, like has a huge marketplace of like integrations.
Yes.
And there just weren't, especially, when we switched to linear, it was brand new. There really wasn't anything in the way of integration. And so we didn't have that as an option anymore. And I just kind of like missed it. It wasn't a big part of our team's process or anything like that, but like just it was one of those few. It was perhaps the only thing that I missed about Jira, let's say.
Well, it's a collaborative moment in a process that's typically pretty dry. You know, it's
Yep.
I get why you would want that in the mix and get everybody's feedback and opinion on that in a slightly fun way. You know, I get that.
Yeah.
Okay, so
when,
you moved to Linear. That was no longer available. So you were like, I write code.
right, when Linear came out with their API, which I don't think there was like a full blown API when we first switched over, but they eventually released a GraphQL API. I thought like, let me just see what it would take to like sort of build the rudimentary version of this. And I think like I've spent a lot of time in the JavaScript world. I've explored Node as like as a platform. Like I've built products on Node, so I'm not totally unfamiliar with it. But I had never at that point, I don't think, used Next.js specifically, and like I don't. What was Vercel before it was Vercel?
Oh, was it something with a Z?
Zeit.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
You know, that was big. And yeah, I was just kind of like, I kind of want to like play with these things and see what they're about.
Okay.
And GraphQL was really at its peak, I think, at that moment in time. Like, the sort of promise of GraphQL was really interesting. And so like it just felt like a project that fit all those, hit all those notes, because the linear integrations were all built on.
So they were providing like little SDKs that were JavaScript, basically. That's for Node.
Yeah. Their API is exclusively GraphQL, which
got it.
Is very frustrating in reality. But if you're building in JavaScript and you're using Apollo and like all the sort of like canonical stuff around that,
it's at
like
least
that
easier
ecosystem,
or bearable.
it
right?
works pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah. This is a separate app built in Next.js that just integrates with Linear. That's how this works.
Yep. Yeah. So basically, what it is you click login. It redirects you over to Linear for an auth flow. We get a token, and then it's all client side. There's really basically no server side other than like authentication.
Okay.
So in the client, I just make the GraphQL API requests to the Linear SDK, to the Linear API, using Linear's SDK because it's all JavaScript. They provide that, and it just pulls up a list of all the tickets that you have in your, I guess, unestimated tickets in triage. There's just like a Kanban board, and you just drag each ticket into the board, and you can click on the ticket to see a preview of the ticket, a couple little things like that, and then when you're done, you just click a button and it saves all those it's all staged, so it doesn't actually make any changes, because a lot of times you end up moving things around once you've okay, we put this in this column, but actually there's a few tickets that are bigger than that, so we'll move it over one column and move, stuff like that.
I feel like that's the thing about the relative that trips me up a little bit, is that like a ticket could come in and kind of blow the thing open and be like, oh, well, this is actually a big ticket, and all these things we put in big ticket are actually not. I guess are they labeled columns, or is it more abstract than that? It's more like you're sort of putting everything kind of on like an unlabeled timeline that's like an infinite. Is that more the vibe?
In the original app that we were using, they were unlabeled, and you applied labels to them after you did all the relative sorting. In my implementation, because basically with Linear, you pick a sizing scale for the project, and then that's like that's tied to the project. So I just generate a column for each item in your scale, whatever the scale is that's assigned to the
Makes sense.
project. But yeah, I mean, my answer to that is mostly just if you bump into a ticket that like blows all the other tickets out, like maybe just leave that because it's not a ticket. It's perhaps a project or 2 tickets or 5
that's
tickets.
true.
You know,
That maybe says
It's
something
like-
more about the ticket than anything
Yeah.
else. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's
it's
fair.
it's more like, yeah, we just don't do that. We just don't pull this one into the board right now, and we just know, okay, there's
You just
something
delete the
here
ticket,
that-
and now it's no more, and now you don't
Yeah.
work on it.
easy peasy. Yeah.
That's the best way to close a ticket. Okay, so is this something that everybody on your team is like able to do individually, or you collaborate on this particular? Like, how did that work?
Yeah, so that was the other interesting thing was I wanted to experiment with some like real time UI stuff. So in addition to having the sort of driver view, there's a viewer component. Every time you essentially once you sign in and you load up a board, it gives you just like a unique URL that's some random string. And you can send that to anyone on on your team, and they basically see the board, and they can see you moving things into columns, and they can they can read, but they can't actually move things around themselves. So that way, if we're on Zoom, screen sharing is fine, but like I think a lot of times you might want to jump into linear and actually look at a couple of other tickets while you're talking about one, or you may need to go somewhere else to like grab some context about a ticket to like effectively have a conversation about it. So it felt like it was better if everyone was just in their own browser, sort of like watching the process and contributing, so that like you're not like stuck in a position of having to have Zoom open and watching the screen share
you can do a little ticket side quests as you need.
Yeah, so that was another fun piece, was like introducing like Pusher and having like multi-channel live updates, and that meant that a lot of the UI has to be it's not exactly as event source, but it's kind of the UI has to be evented in a way so that like as these changes come in through that WebSocket stream, you can apply them to the UI, which is really interesting. It's an interesting problem to solve.
How did you find that in that ecosystem? Like, did you find that pretty straightforward or easier, harder than what we're used to? Because I'm used to doing that with the broadcast driver and typically Echo, and sometimes I'll reach a little deeper if I need to go deeper. But how did you find it in that ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I think that React happens to be very well suited to this type of implementation. Going back to like Redux and now just like use Reducer or like a bunch of the patterns in the React world are essentially around this idea of like events or actions or some type of thing comes in and it changes the shape of your state, and then the UI re-renders to reflect the new shape of the state. So essentially I just adopted that pattern for the entire UI, and then instead of all of the events coming in from like clicks or typing or whatever, some events were just coming in from the WebSocket, and it's just then it was just a matter of like you filter out the events that are from you, and only like any events that you are firing locally just get applied locally, and then all events come through that stream, and you just apply any ones that didn't happen locally. And it's surprisingly resilient and works pretty well. There are times when it would get a little janky, and there's a little bit of like conflict resolution stuff that you have to deal with from time to time, but if you design your events to be relatively small and their effects to be idempotent, like you can get away with a lot. It's a pretty cool way to build, to build like a real time UI.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I think, if I remember correctly, Laravel has that. What is the method? I don't remember what the method is, but it's basically saying like broadcast this to everybody but me, so that you don't get the like sort of echoey feedback of your own actions, which I always appreciated. Yeah, that's cool. So I didn't realize that like there was a real time aspect to it, which is fun. Let's talk about GraphQL for a moment. I have never ever worked with GraphQL. I know enough about it to be dangerous, but also little enough about it to really need to start from scratch if I were to like work with it. Upsides, downsides. Would you ever want to work with it again? How do you? I mean, you kind of alluded to like not the promise that they didn't fulfill the promise that they set out. But how do you feel about it?
I think GraphQL. I think a lot of the ideas behind GraphQL are still really smart. Being able to essentially just build a query that asks for everything that you need at once and asks only for what you need and can potentially span across multiple data sources. Like from the client side, it doesn't really care about where the data is coming from. It just says, I need the user and their team and all the tickets and like the ticket statuses, and like I don't really care what it takes on the server to get me that data. Like that's just what I need, It's
like the ultimate flexible API from the client's perspective. Yeah.
And I think like it facilitates API change in, I think, a really nice way, because you can essentially add and deprecate fields without like having to introduce new endpoints. Occasionally you do have to like version an endpoint, I think, but in a lot of times you can just get away with just adding a new field, leaving the old field until no one is asking for that anymore, and then removing it. So I think that's cool, and I do think that there's a lot to be said for the idea of just like, okay, we've just exposed essentially the true API, right? Rather than sort of abstract it behind something like REST. Like in a lot of ways, you're just like exposing the actual things that can happen in like a little bit more of a I don't know, in a way that feels like a little more honest to me, maybe.
It's also that exact reason is why it always makes me nervous, because I'm like, oh yeah, it feels very open, which is not a bad thing, but and I know that there's control mechanisms, on the other side of the equation, but I'm like, oh man, it's just out there, It's just like they're just asking for what they want, and they're getting it. That's wild,
I think that that's 100% legit, and that I was gonna put that on the other side as well. Is that because it's so open, like on one hand it's like having to adhere to REST conventions when something isn't like sort of a resource with a CRUD operation can feel a little weird. But at the same
you're like
time,
shimming it in, it feels bad.
Yeah. At the same time, it's like, okay, if we're only thinking in these like 5 verbs, and like everything is a resource, it makes it easier to guess in a large system where you might go for something, right? Because like in a GraphQL API, you might just have a function that's like, get issues for team by type or whatever.
Right.
And that's like very descriptive, and like it tells you what it does, and it does what it tells you. But like if I am trying to find all the issues for a team by their type, like in a RESTful API, I can immediately like know I'm looking for like the issues resource that's like a child of a team that's like got a type filter on it, right?
Right.
I don't have to guess at like what the name that the developers picked for the function is, you know?
Yeah, what does discoverability look like? Is there discoverability with GraphQL?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the cool thing is it's an entirely self-documenting system. So like
Yeah.
by having a GraphQL schema, you basically just get a full like API viewer for free. So like
Okay.
anything that's got a GraphQL schema, you essentially can see like there's tools that just give you really nice ways to browse all the methods, view all the types, see how they interact with each other. It's really nice in that regard, and because it's like very, very parsable, like IDEs can pull that in. So like, you know, in my IDE, like when I was working with the linear APIs, like I just got autocomplete on everything for free.
Well, I was going to
without
ask you about
having
that.
to do anything, you know?
I don't know if this was the same project or if you were working with the linear API for another reason, but I remember you showing me like were you parsing like the like GraphQL schema into something specific to PHP Storm that allowed, like, you talk about that, because that was
Yeah.
this is another
Well,
side project quest that was fascinating, and I mean, the level of IDE autocompletion and intelligence around what you were doing when it felt like a very dynamic interface was really impressive. Like, talk about that for a second.
Yeah, this gets into this gets into the main problem with GraphQL.
Okay, perfect.
Which is,
we're still on track.
Yeah, which is GraphQL is great if you are like really sticking to JavaScript, and even I would say like if you're using sort of like the main tooling, so like if you're using Apollo and Relay and like some of these, like there's like the correct way to consume a GraphQL API, and it's like it's a pretty specific set of like criteria. And so if you want to work with that API in any other way, it sucks. That's the big downside of GraphQL, is like it's pretty great if you're doing it exactly the way that it's meant to be done. But yeah, I'm a PHP developer. I wanted to integrate with linear in PHP, and like, yeah, fundamentally GraphQL is just a JSON like string that you post to an endpoint. So I could just like do a big here doc blob of GraphQL query and like just use the HTTP facade to send it to the API, and like,
but who wants to live that way?
Yeah, I'd get JSON back and it would work, right? But it's not a good experience by any means.
Feels bad.
Like,
feels bad in your heart.
Yeah, you don't get any code completion. You don't get any like syntax highlighting. You just like lose all of the modern niceties of development.
Yeah.
So yeah, I went down this whole rabbit hole of building a PHP SDK for the GraphQL API, for the linear GraphQL API, and it was very fascinating because I was able to essentially take, because it's like a formal definition of their API, I was able to parse that into an abstract syntax tree.
Yes.
And then walk that tree, right? So for every node in the tree, one node might be a function, or actually in GraphQL.
Well, so wait, back up for one second. When you say it's a definition, how are you receiving that? How is it JSON, the definition?
It's a .GraphQL file. It's like its own
own
format.
thing.
Yep.
Okay, got it.
It's
okay,
JSON. It's JSON-like.
JSON plus.
If you're familiar with JSON, it looks very familiar. It's JavaScript-y, JSON-y.
Okay.
But with
you took that definition and you started walking it as an AST, and next.
Yeah, and to be clear, like, I didn't write the parser. Someone else has written an incredible PHP parser for GraphQL, right? So,
but you source dived the parser to understand how it worked. I bet.
I source dived. Yeah, I looked at it some, and Yeah, so like that just gives you an abstract syntax tree, right? So that's just like a tree of every statement in this file, right? So like you'll have GraphQL has like queries and mutations. So you'll have a node that represents the query, but then like inside of it there'll be a node for like the name of the query, and then a node for like query parameters, and then a child of the query parameters node would be like a query parameter node that then has a child that's like the type node that's like the parameter type, and then the name node.
Of course.
Like, it's like this big tree of data about it, and that's why it's called it's a data about the syntax of the file, right? It's like but what was so cool was there's also an incredible PHP language parser that exists that has essentially the opposite. It lets you build a tree,
construct it,
and then just like take that tree and spit out the PHP code that tree would represent.
Which one did you use? The Microsoft one or the I'm blanking out on the name of it, but I know it's the other one. That's
yeah.
Is it just called, it's not just called PHP parser, right? It's
it might be just like PHP parser.
I know which one you're talking about. I looked at that one too. Yeah.
The Microsoft cool. one is really good for parsing partially complete
stuff. Yeah.
But it's a little less formal in its approach.
It goes like a completely different direction because I think it's going like token by token to try to like fix it as it goes if it needs to, or alert you when it's gone wild or whatever. But this one is like, we understand this to be, well, actually you were working from the other direction, so it didn't even matter. You were building this up from the other side, which is so cool. That's awesome.
It was such a cool experience because it was so I have this tree of GraphQL, and I essentially just like wrote some glue code that said, hey, when you see like this node, just like turn it into this PHP tree node, right? And like they're not one to one, but they actually are pretty close, in representation. So essentially, when I saw a mutation, like I turned it into a class that like extends this mutation class that I wrote, right? When I saw a query, I created a class that extends a query class that I wrote. And
so you just generated an SDK basically for yourself for linear that's in PHP.
It's a full auto-generated linear SDK with like 100% type, compatibility with the GraphQL API. And like as linear releases GraphQL, like changes to their API, you just run a command and it spits out new code. Yeah. It's such a cool. It's not super well documented right now. That's kind of the next step. But the nice thing is, like, you can look at the linear documentation, and essentially it works 100% the same way.
Well, you could probably also generate
exactly
the docs, like, because you're.
I hate generated documentation. Yeah.
Well, all right, fair, but. I don't know. You're generating the code. I bet you could do. You get pretty far, and then maybe hand roll some of it or something like that. But
maybe.
I don't know.
Yeah,
maybe at least code examples or something like that could be.
Sure.
You hate this so much.
No,
I can see this.
Well, that's mostly what I've done. Is just like there are a couple code examples on the README. And that's like hopefully enough to get you started. And then, you just literally look at the existing linear GraphQL documentation. And it's like, if their docs say like, whatever example, get issues by team of type or whatever. I can't remember what I said. But like, if their docs has a function called that, then like you literally just call that function on the SDK and it's there and it takes exactly the same like inputs as the GraphQL one does, and like it's a little that can be a little clunky because this is mostly convention, but by convention GraphQL tends to it cares about types a lot. So like a function, like a mutation, typically takes like an input that is like a new object type. So like if I had like a, update user function, typically you will have like a, an update user input type that function accepts, and that type has all the data that like would be the arguments for the function.
Okay.
And that doesn't map one-to-one with the way like PHP developers typically work. So the one downside of the SDK in my experience is like you end up needing to instantiate a bunch of like sort of intermediate objects to like represent the data, and it's okay. I honestly
they basically
don't know.
serve as like data, like DTOs, basically.
They're just DTOs, yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah, okay,
Yep.
all right.
But they like account for the fact that like a lot of these functions can take 500 inputs or whatever, or like 40 inputs, and all of them are nullable, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just like an object with like you put as many keys with values as you want on them.
Yep.
On it, and that's like super straightforward and easy in like a JSON-like format. But like in PHP, you need to instantiate something for each one of those, or like, I thought about, okay, you could pass like an array with just like string keys, but then like you lose all of the like type magic that the rest of the
I wish
SDK
we had
has.
that. I miss
Yes, I know.
flipping back and forth between languages. That's one of those things I really miss. Yeah.
So, but that was a really interesting project, and that did come from, I think that this, to kind of go back to the original premise that we were talking about at the beginning of the show, like, I don't know that I would have approached it the same way had I not like worked with the linear GraphQL API years ago.
Yep.
I think I would have approached it. I would have come to it with different like expectations or like a different approach to the.
So I assume, based on the way you're talking about it, that the linear poker is not active and it's not being used.
It's around. It still exists. We don't use it. We don't use it actively. Every once in a while, I think about doing a planning session where we use it, but we don't for whatever reason. So it's just like it's still sitting there.
But you're clearly integrating something with linear. It sounds like on a PHP side, and that's an active project, or that's an active integration.
I'm not yet. I have some. I want to write some sort of like daily. Sort of like cron type things to do some automated cleanup on our linear tickets. I think it's kind of interesting. So a couple of ideas that we've had are essentially like priority decay. So like if a ticket has been sitting undone for a certain period of time, bump the priority down by one notch. Right?
Because it's clearly not a priority.
Right. If it hasn't been done, like the priority goes down. And then the opposite is deadline prioritization. So like being able to throw a ticket in that's low priority with a deadline that's like a far future deadline, knowing that like as the deadline approaches, the priority of the ticket will start to bump up and like it'll surface itself.
So smart.
So those are two things that I think would just be really cool, and I just thought, we'll just like have a scheduled task that does this every day on our linear tickets.
Smart. Yeah, that makes sense.
John's using it a bunch for paper cuts, so he's actively using the SDK for that.
Okay, cool.
And that's like the first place where it's actively being used. But other than sort of like helping him out with that a tiny bit, I don't know much about his implementation with it.
Side projects, not a waste of time. That's the verdict. We have actively taken a piece of concrete knowledge and skill from a side project and put it into something useful and active. That's the takeaway here.
Yeah. I know that we're getting close to the end, and I feel like there's one thing that like I I did, I thought was an interesting, I don't know, I think is interesting, which
Hit me.
is using Vercel and Next gave me like a deep appreciation for like what I hope Laravel Cloud eventually becomes.
Okay, talk on that.
In that, like, it made me realize that, like, as much as Laravel has a pretty good deployment story right now, like, with Vercel and Next, it's like you create a Next app, and then you just, like, point Vercel at that, like, Git repo, and it is just, now you just have a URL for that app. Like,
it's pretty
that's
strong.
all, like, there is no step 3, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
it just worked, and it's like, oh, I want like another thing at this URL. I just put a file there, like in the pages directory, and it just, now that file reacts to that. Like the file based routing in Next, I think, is really nice for the things that it does well. And the integration, like that like sort of deep integration with the platform makes it just like these features kind of sing together. The like server-side props stuff. I don't know how familiar you are with how like React and like server rendered stuff works, but like, you know, this is pre-modern like use server, use client stuff. But it was just so easy to just like, you just define a little function at the top of your file that's like, this is this is stuff that only runs in the server, and it does privileged work. I thought it was like really, it made me realize like the gaps that like in what we have. And yeah, so that was really interesting to me, and then I needed literally anything else. And it made me appreciate just how great Laravel is. It's like, oh, I have to like write my own session handling, because
what
if I want sessions, like either I have to write my own thing or pull in some like third-party authentication package that like talks to Auth0 or whatever. Like every single thing.
Next is not handling anything in that realm?
At the time, I just looked at the code. Like I just have my own like use session hook that literally is like parsing the cookie and storing something in like whatever Vercel's like key value store is. And like, I know that, I'm sure that there's a better story for that now. You know, because this project
should we timestamp this? When was this? So this was like
this is a number of years ago. Let me see if I can. Let me look at this code base and see if I have a sense of like. Yeah, so this is like 3 or 4 years old.
Okay. All right. So a lot's happened since then.
A lot has happened since then. Yeah.
I hope that is now being handled at some level.
Yeah. But like,
so the like headline of this episode is, so that was my next question, is like, is Vercel doing any heavy lifting on like detecting what's in your package.json and helping you out there in terms of like, no. So there is a little bit of you have to do a couple of things to set up like your database,
I take that back. I mean, all that stuff gets installed.
No, of course,
automatically. Yeah. But no, like, if you want to talk to a database, like at the time, the answer was, is there a way for you not to talk to a database? Like,
oh no.
It was
not
like,
that.
What if you used Firebase instead? Or what, you know, like, there really wasn't. I mean, not to say, obviously people were solving this problem. And like Prisma.
Well, it was an external provider is basically the answer, is that you went elsewhere for it.
it was not pretty. And if you did it, like, it's not, you're no longer on Vercel anymore, right? So like, if I wanted to talk to a database, I had to sign up for a third-party database provider and like hook all that
use
stuff
their
up.
SDK probably. That there is a different situation. Yeah.
And you're immediately outside of like the like that's the thing is like when you're inside the gates, right, of like Next and Vercel, it's so cool because like everything just like was so gloriously integrated. But like those gates are like holding in such a small little garden, right? Like it's basically routing and rendering. And you know, it turns out that like I could build a whole planning poker app with just routing and rendering because all I needed to do was like I could do all my data fetching client side using linear SDK. Like I didn't actually have to store any data. So it was super great. And I've built other things. Another project that we talked about is this like code deck thing. That's another tool where it doesn't need to have any server side state. And so like I shipped that on Vercel because it was like, this is by nature entirely a client side application. And just being able to just point this thing at a Git repo and have a URL to send someone is so great. So if you really are in that space of like all I care about is routing and rendering, and like I can defer, either I can rely on third-party tools for all the other stuff. There are places where that's great, but it's just like you just get so little, you know, and you have to start. You just have to make your own decisions about everything else.
It's the decision-making fatigue that is sort of the issue here. But I do think that the title of this episode will probably be Chris Loves Vercel, and I think that makes a lot of sense and will sell well on the podcast feed. Dude, this was such a pleasure. I could talk to you all day, but you know, we have lives. But
this has been great.
You have a stockpile of projects, so trust and believe you'll be back on again to talk about. I mean, I think you mentioned one more. A code deck was one of them, and then you mentioned I think another one at some point, which I'm blanking on right now, but. I know that you've got enough domains to talk about alone. We could just do an episode where you pull up your domain list and we go one by one and say, the intention was this. And I go, what lives there now? And you go, nothing. Next domain. The intention was this. And I go, what lives there now? And you go, nothing. But that's an episode. But actually, that would be fascinating to hear what the plan was, or even the potential seed of an idea was for all of your domains.
That would be fun. I'd be happy to do it.
Look out, listener. That's coming your way. That'd be fun. We'll trade. You know what? We'll pick our top like 10 each, and that would
Only
be a
10?
great episode. Is that too little or too much?
Well, it's just
you have like hundreds, I think.
I'd really have to pare it down if we're only doing 10.
Yeah.
No, I'm just
We also have to announce our dead domain budget, like just like latent domains that are just sitting there, and how much we spend on them every year, which I don't want to calculate that because it's going to feel bad.
Yeah. Well, I told you, like, we used to back in the day. So, you know, I've been doing web development professionally since the 90s. Yeah. And you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were things that we could do for SEO that let's just say are not approved these days.
Yes.
And one of them was, for example, buying 700 domains that were highly targeted to the topics that were relevant to your business, and then paying Rackspace a ridiculous amount of money for 700 unique IP addresses.
Yes.
And building a
little SEO farm
network of sites that all link to each other. And God, when I finally I'll always remember, it was 717 domains. It was every state homeinspector.com.net.org with and without hyphens.
Oh my
both
God.
Spelled out and not and shortened, right? So PA-homeinspector.com.net.org, PA-homeinspector, PA-home-inspector.
But that was so common. It was so common to do that stuff back then, you know?
But God, when I finally was like, this,
We're done here.
We haven't used these in a long time. Like, this strategy doesn't work.
Yeah.
And like marked all of those to expire. It was a good day. It was.
You took him out behind the barn, and you're like,
yeah.
This is unfortunately your time has come. Look out over the field. Yeah.
Relief.
Was that effective though? That must have been effective for a while, probably.
Oh,
I'm sure.
for a long time. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and honestly, I didn't feel that bad about it because each one of them did. Like we listed every member in that state on each one of those sites and had some content.
Yeah.
So it was like, if you went to pahominspector.org, you got a list of certified inspectors in Pennsylvania,
useful.
right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't the worst. It wasn't the worst like spammy thing in the world. But I mean, we built.
No, but that's how you got juice. That was how you did it.
Yeah.
You got the juice. Dude, what a pleasure. I'm gonna plug something for you. I'm gonna plug Over Engineered. It's amazing. I love Over Engineered. I always listen to it. It's a podcast that Chris does where he wait, let me see if I can do it. Where we talk about the best way to do something, or the best way to do something that we already have a good way to do. No, that's not right.
Yeah,
do it.
something like that. The absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for.
There we go. Nailed it. It's excellent. You should go check it out. Over Engineered. Anything else you want to plug? Where can people find you?
Well, you can find me on Mastodon, artisan.rtsn.dev, and on Twitter, or you can go to cmorrell.com to get my socials. And I'm going to be speaking at LairCon EU in February, so come to Amsterdam.
Come to Amsterdam. It's so good. I'm very excited for it. Sorry, I didn't mean to override you, but I'm very excited for you to speak at EU.
I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This has been really fun.
This was a blast. Thanks, dude.